The Mexican cavalry officer sat on his horse at the edge of the desert, staring at the tracks that had suddenly vanished into the rock and sand before him. His name was Colonel Miguel Garcia, and he had spent 23 years commanding cavalry units on the northern frontier of Sonora and Chihuahua. He had fought against Apache raiders dozens of times. He had pursued war parties across terrain that seemed designed to swallow men whole. He had lost soldiers to ambushes and to the simple exhaustion of chasing enemies who never seemed to tire. But the peculiar frustration he felt in this moment, standing with 50 cavalry soldiers at his back and absolutely no idea where the Apache had gone, represented something different from the usual challenges of frontier warfare. The tracks had been clear just moments before. The Apache party, perhaps 20 warriors, Garcia estimated, had been moving south at a steady pace, heading toward the Sierra Madre, toward the sanctuary that the Mexican government could not effectively penetrate. Garcia's cavalry had been pursuing for 2 days without rest, keeping pace with the raiders, waiting for the moment when the Apache would make a mistake, when they would slow down, when they would attempt to fight rather than flee. That moment had never come. The Apache had simply moved, hour after hour, maintaining a pace that exhausted Garcia's cavalry while the Apache themselves seemed to maintain some reserve of strength and attention. And then, at this moment, on this particular stretch of terrain where the desert transitioned into rock formations, the tracks had simply ceased to be readable. The Apache had not vanished into thin air. They had used a strategy so systematized, so predictable, and yet so impossible to counter that Garcia had encountered it dozens of times and still could not devise a response that worked. What Garcia did not understand, what would take another 50 years of military history for anyone to properly articulate, was that the Apache had not invented this strategy to defeat cavalry. They had invented it to survive, and the fact that it simultaneously made cavalry pursuit impossible was almost an incidental benefit. The strategy involved a complete separation between the direction in which the Apache were traveling and the direction in which the cavalry would naturally follow. It involved understanding something about how horses moved, how humans perceived danger, and how the landscape itself could be used as an ally in ways that seemed almost supernatural to people who had not learned to read it. Before we talk about what made this strategy so devastatingly effective, I want to understand something about how you think about problems. When you're trying to catch someone who is running away from you, how do you predict where they are going? Do you follow the path they have taken? Do you anticipate where they might be heading based on geography or landmarks? Do you try to position yourself ahead of them to cut off their escape? If you are watching this right now on your phone or computer, I would love to hear in the comments what your instinct would be if you were pursuing someone across unfamiliar terrain. Because the answer to that question reveals why Apache warriors defeated Mexican cavalry so consistently, and why the strategy that Apache used became so feared that Mexican officers would eventually develop a kind of psychological dread when they realized they were facing an Apache war party that had employed it. The reason I ask is because the Apache strategy was not based on moving faster or fighting harder or being braver than Mexican cavalry. It was based on understanding something fundamental about how human beings pursue targets, and how that pursuit could be systematically misdirected. Understanding this principle matters because it explains not just Apache military effectiveness, but a broader truth about how intelligence and adaptation can consistently defeat superior force. So where are you watching from? And more importantly, would you trust your own instincts about where an enemy was going? Or would you be willing to question those instincts when they were contradicted by what skilled trackers were telling you? The central puzzle that defined Mexican military operations on the northern frontier for nearly 60 years was deceptively simple in appearance, but enormously complex in its implications. How could Apache war parties, numbering anywhere from 5 to 50 warriors, consistently evade, escape from, and occasionally defeat Mexican cavalry units that numbered in the hundreds and that possessed superior horses, superior weapons, and the advantage of operating from established military bases? The Mexican government had invested considerable resources in frontier defense. By the 1850s, Sonora and Chihuahua maintained a network of presidios, military forts positioned at strategic locations throughout the north. These forts housed cavalry units, artillery, and provisions. They were supplied by supply trains that moved regularly from central Mexico. They were commanded by officers who had received military training. Yet despite these advantages, Mexican cavalry remained perpetually unable to effectively suppress Apache raiding. This was not a matter of Mexican soldiers lacking courage or fighting ability. Mexican cavalry soldiers were professional military men, trained in cavalry tactics, skilled horsemen, accustomed to frontier warfare. The problem was not that they were inadequate soldiers. The problem was that they were operating according to a set of assumptions about how pursuit and warfare worked, and those assumptions were fundamentally misaligned with the methods that Apache warriors employed. The paradox was this: the Apache had developed a strategy so simple in its conception and so devastating in its application that Mexican cavalry officers could articulate what the Apache were doing, could recognize the signs that indicated the strategy was being employed, and could still find themselves completely unable to effectively counter it. This created a psychological dynamic in which Mexican cavalry became increasingly demoralized by an enemy that seemed to operate according to principles that made conventional military response impossible. The strategy that created this impossible situation was called, in Spanish, the separación de huellas, the separation of traces. In English, it might more accurately be called the strategy of false direction, or the systematic misdirection of pursuit. The strategy worked through a principle so fundamental and yet so effective that it would eventually become a textbook example of tactical adaptation. The Apache would deliberately create multiple tracks leading in different directions, with some tracks being genuine signs of their movement and other tracks being deliberate deceptions. Mexican cavalry, pursuing what they believed was the main Apache force, would follow one set of tracks, while the actual Apache war party moved in a completely different direction. The strategy was not invented all at once. It had evolved gradually, refined over decades, becoming increasingly sophisticated as Apache warriors learned from repeated encounters with Mexican cavalry what human assumptions about tracking they could exploit. The first factor that explains why this strategy was so effective had to do with the basic human tendency to assume that the most obvious evidence is the most reliable evidence. When Mexican cavalry scouts were pursuing an Apache war party, they would naturally follow the trail that seemed most prominent, most recent, most clearly indicating the direction of travel. The Apache understood this tendency intimately. They understood that a human being, when given multiple possible paths to follow, would naturally choose the path that seemed to provide the clearest evidence. The Apache would therefore create 2 or 3 different trails, each one appearing to have been made recently, each one pointing in a different direction. The largest group of warriors would deliberately create the least obvious trail, the one that was hardest to read, the one that would require the most skill to follow. Meanwhile, smaller groups would create more obvious trails that would be immediately apparent to less experienced trackers. When Mexican cavalry scouts arrived at the point of divergence, they would typically follow the obvious trail, the one that seemed to be the main force. The Apache understood this and would accordingly arrange the decoys. The strategy exploited a fundamental assumption, that obvious evidence is more reliable than subtle evidence. In reality, the opposite was often true. The most carefully disguised trail, the one that required the most skill to read, was usually the one being followed by the genuine Apache force. The second factor was the fundamental mismatch between how Mexican cavalry thought about pursuit and how Apache warriors thought about escape. Mexican cavalry officers had been trained in a military system that emphasized directness, clarity of objective, and the shortest path to the goal. When pursuing an enemy, the instinct of the cavalry officer was to move as directly as possible toward the enemy's destination, to anticipate where the enemy was heading, and to try to cut off the escape route. This required the officer to make assumptions about where the enemy was going. The Apache, by contrast, did not operate with a predetermined destination in the way that Mexican cavalry officers imagined. The Apache objective was not to reach a specific location by a specific time. The objective was to escape with the knowledge that pursuit was not productive. The Apache would therefore move in ways that seemed random or circuitous to someone thinking in military terms, but that were actually calculated to frustrate the assumptions that cavalry officers would naturally make. If a cavalry officer assumed the Apache were heading toward the Sierra Madre to the east, the Apache might deliberately move southwest for an entire day before circling back, deliberately creating tracks that seemed to indicate commitment to the southwest direction. The cavalry officer, following his assumption about the destination, would press forward in pursuit of what he believed was the escaping force, only to realize days later that he had been pursuing the wrong trail entirely. By that point, the actual Apache force was days ahead, having completed their actual movement toward their actual destination, while the cavalry was committed to pursuit of a phantom. The third factor was the psychological effect of discovering that pursuit had been misdirected. The realization that you have been pursuing the wrong trail is not simply a military setback. It is a profound psychological blow. The cavalry officer who discovers that his pursuit has been fruitless faces not only the fact of his failure, but also the recognition that he has been deliberately deceived. This recognition is especially difficult to process when the deception was accomplished through relatively simple means. The Apache had not defeated the cavalry through superior force or superior firepower. The Apache had defeated the cavalry through superior understanding of how the cavalry thought. This created a psychological dynamic in which Mexican cavalry became increasingly reluctant to commit fully to pursuit, increasingly doubtful about which trail was genuine, increasingly aware that their pursuit might be playing directly into Apache strategy. Some cavalry officers responded to this uncertainty by splitting their forces, sending different units to pursue different trails. But this response actually played perfectly into Apache hands. The Apache had anticipated that cavalry might split their forces, and had therefore arranged the false trails in such a way that the cavalry would split into groups that were too small to pose a significant threat. Mexican cavalry would commit 50 soldiers to pursuit and would divide into smaller units pursuing different trails, each unit thinking it was pursuing the main force. When they rejoined, having discovered that both trails were false or that they had each been pursuing a small decoy group, they would realize that the genuine Apache force was now far beyond pursuit, and that the cavalry's attempt to be clever had actually weakened their position. The fourth factor was the role of terrain knowledge in creating trails that were difficult to distinguish from genuine travel. The Apache did not create false trails randomly. The Apache trails were created with sophisticated understanding of how different types of terrain would show evidence of passage. A trail created across rock would show subtle marks of hooves touching stone. A trail created through sand would show different evidence of passage than a trail created through soft earth. An Apache warrior who was creating a false trail understood these details intimately and would create evidence of passage that was realistic and convincing. Mexican cavalry, following what they believed was a trail, might spend hours determining that they were following genuine evidence of horse passage, genuine evidence of a moving force, only to eventually realize that the trail ended nowhere or led to a location that made no strategic sense for the Apache to occupy. The subtlety of the false trails meant that Mexican cavalry could not simply dismiss trails that seemed unconvincing. A trail that was difficult to read might be a false trail created by Apache who understood that cavalry would be following, or it might be a genuine trail that had simply been created in terrain that naturally made evidence of passage subtle. This uncertainty created constant pressure on Mexican cavalry to commit resources to pursuing trails that might or might not be genuine. The fifth factor was the systematic way in which Apache warriors had learned to coordinate the creation of false trails with the creation of genuine trails. This coordination required that Apache war parties develop a level of sophistication in their planning that Mexican cavalry did not anticipate. The Apache would not simply create false trails haphazardly. Instead, Apache leaders would assign specific warriors to create specific false trails, would specify the direction and distance that each false trail should go, and would coordinate the timing of the false trails so that they would all converge on the main point of divergence. The genuine Apache force would move together, creating subtle evidence of passage, deliberately moving in ways that would be harder to read than the false trails. The result was a situation in which the most obvious and easiest to read trails were false, while the most subtle and hardest to read trail was the genuine one. This was a complete inversion of the natural assumption that Mexican cavalry would make, and it was coordinated with enough precision that multiple Apache war parties, dispersed across different parts of the frontier, would employ the same strategy with remarkable consistency, suggesting that the strategy was not invented by individual war leaders, but had become part of the collective knowledge of Apache warfare. The sixth factor was the cultural understanding among Apache warriors that this strategy was legitimate and effective, and therefore worthy of consistent practice and refinement. This might seem obvious, but it is actually important. For a strategy to become systematized, to be passed down from one generation of warriors to the next, to be refined and improved over time, there has to be cultural recognition that the strategy is not only effective, but also worthy of respect and careful study. The Apache had this cultural recognition. The warriors who were most skilled at creating false trails, at understanding how cavalry would respond, at calculating the psychological effects of pursuit and misdirection, were honored within Apache society. Young warriors learned these skills through apprenticeship with experienced warriors. The knowledge was systematized and passed down. This meant that by the time the strategy had been practiced for several decades, it had reached a level of sophistication that was nearly impossible for Mexican cavalry to counter. Mexican cavalry, meanwhile, had not developed any comparable cultural practice of systematically analyzing their own failures and learning from them. Individual cavalry officers might eventually understand the strategy intellectually, but this understanding did not become embedded in military doctrine or systematically taught to new cavalry officers arriving on the frontier. The seventh factor was the specific advantage that Apache warriors gained from understanding the horses themselves. Mexican cavalry relied on horses. The horses were essential for pursuit, for rapid movement, for the mobility that made cavalry effective. But horses had limitations that Apache warriors understood intimately. A horse that had been moving at a fast pace for many hours would begin to show signs of fatigue. A horse would instinctively move toward water, toward grazing, toward rest. A horse ridden hard would sweat, would show signs of the direction and duration of travel. The Apache understood these realities and would account for them when creating false trails. A false trail might be created in a direction where there was no water, knowing that cavalry horses would eventually need water and would therefore need to turn back. A false trail might be created across terrain that was exhausting for horses, knowing that pursuing cavalry would eventually reach a point where they had to rest. The genuine Apache trail, meanwhile, would move in directions where water was available, would cross terrain that was easier on horses, would maintain a pace that the pursuing cavalry could almost match, but not quite. The result was that Mexican cavalry, following a false trail, would exhaust their horses before realizing that they were pursuing the wrong direction. When they finally turned back, their horses were too exhausted to effectively pursue anything. The Apache, traveling on the genuine trail, maintained horses that were fresh enough to continue moving for days more if necessary. This gave Apache warriors a practical advantage that Mexican cavalry could not overcome, simply through courage or military skill. The concrete example that best illustrates all of these factors working together involved a raid that took place in July of 1862, when an Apache war party led by a warrior named Victorio raided the town of Chihuas in Chihuahua and made off with approximately 40 cattle and horses. The raid had been devastating, but limited in scope. Victorio had struck quickly, killed several Mexican soldiers, and begun moving south toward the Sierra Madre with his captured animals and his raiders. Colonel Garcia, commanding the cavalry garrison at Llanos, roughly 60 miles to the north of Chihuas, received word of the raid approximately 18 hours after it had occurred. Garcia immediately mobilized a cavalry unit of approximately 70 soldiers and began moving south to intercept Victorio. This was standard procedure for frontier defense. When a raid occurred, cavalry would pursue, attempting to catch the raiders while they were still in Mexican territory and before they could reach the sanctuary of the Sierra Madre. Garcia's cavalry had a significant advantage in numbers over Victorio's estimated 25 warriors. Garcia had horses that were reasonably fresh. Garcia had a military advantage in firepower and tactical organization. By the logic of conventional warfare, Garcia should have been able to either catch Victorio's war party before they reached the Sierra Madre, or at least inflict casualties that would deter further raiding. What actually happened demonstrated the weakness of conventional military logic when applied to Apache warfare. Garcia's cavalry caught up to Victorio's trail at approximately dawn the next morning. The trail was obvious. A war party moving with captured cattle and horses would leave substantial evidence of passage. Garcia could see the hoof prints, the dust raised by the moving animals, signs of where the Apache had camped the previous night. Based on this evidence, Garcia concluded that Victorio's party was still moving toward the Sierra Madre at a pace that was constrained by the captured livestock. Garcia estimated that his cavalry might be able to catch Victorio before reaching the mountains. Garcia pressed forward with his cavalry, pushing the pace to make up the distance between his position and Victorio's party. As the day progressed, however, Garcia began to notice something strange. The trail seemed to be moving in a direction that was not the most direct route to the Sierra Madre. The trail was curving, turning, moving in directions that seemed illogical if the objective was to reach the mountains as quickly as possible. Garcia shared his observation with his most experienced scouts, but the scouts could only confirm that the trail they were following showed continuous evidence of the Apache moving in the direction indicated. So Garcia continued to follow, pressing his cavalry forward, increasingly frustrated by the inefficient direction that the trail seemed to take. By midday of the second day of pursuit, Garcia's scouts reported something that should have been a warning, but instead seemed like confirmation that Garcia was on the right track. They had discovered a point where the trail diverged. What had appeared to be a single trail was actually multiple trails, branching off in different directions. The main trail, the one that seemed to show the most recent passage, the one with the freshest hoofprints, continued south toward the Sierra Madre. But two other trails branched off, one heading southwest and one heading southeast. Garcia's scouts reported that the southwestern trail appeared to show signs of recent passage as well. Garcia's first instinct was to commit his entire force to following the southern trail, which seemed to be the main trail. But then doubt began to creep in. What if the apparent main trail was actually a false trail? What if the Apache had deliberately created multiple trails knowing that cavalry would appear? Garcia made a decision that seemed militarily logical. He split his cavalry. 40 soldiers would follow the southern trail, 30 soldiers would follow the southwestern trail. If the southern trail was genuine, the larger force would be following it. If the southwestern trail was genuine, the smaller force would at least gather intelligence about Apache movements. What Garcia did not realize was that he had made exactly the decision the Apache had anticipated. Victorio, watching from a position in the high terrain where he could observe Mexican cavalry without being observed himself, had known that Garcia would split his forces. The southern trail, the most obvious trail, the trail showing the freshest evidence of passage, was a false trail created deliberately to draw a cavalry pursuit. The southwestern trail, which seemed less obvious and which Garcia had assigned only 30 soldiers to pursue, was actually close to the genuine Apache position. But not so close that the 30 cavalry soldiers could actually catch them. The Apache objective was not to draw cavalry into an ambush, where Apache would be at a disadvantage. The Apache objective was to split the Mexican cavalry into multiple small forces that were too weak to pose a significant threat. What followed was a classic Apache withdrawal. The main cavalry force, following the false southern trail, eventually realized that they had been deceived. The southwestern force, pursuing what seemed like a more promising trail, found themselves deep in terrain where Apache warriors were moving faster than Mexican cavalry could match. By the third day of pursuit, both cavalry units had exhausted their horses and had turned back, having successfully been separated from each other and having successfully been prevented from engaging the Apache in any meaningful way. Victorio and his war party, meanwhile, had reached the Sierra Madre with their captured livestock intact, their warriors unharmed, and with the knowledge that their strategy had worked exactly as intended. When Garcia reported his failure to his superiors, he did something that reveals the psychological impact of this strategy. Rather than arguing that he had been defeated by superior Apache military skill or superior force, Garcia argued that he had been defeated by Apache deception and misdirection. He wrote in his report that he had believed he was following the main Apache force and had only discovered too late that he had been deliberately deceived. The implication of Garcia's report was uncomfortable, that Apache warfare was not primarily about fighting, but about thinking differently about pursuit, about understanding human psychology, about deliberately creating situations in which cavalry assumptions would be exploited. This implication was difficult for Mexican military officers to accept because it suggested that cavalry could be defeated not by being outfought, but by being outthought. This realization gradually spread through Mexican military circles. Apache raids continued, and each time cavalry pursued, there was now the awareness that the pursuit might be based on false trails and misdirection. Some cavalry officers began to doubt their own judgment about which trails were genuine. Others became increasingly reluctant to pursue with full commitment, knowing that they might be playing directly into Apache strategy. The morale of Mexican cavalry, despite their superior numbers and superior equipment, began to decline because the certainty of their military superiority was being undermined by the realization that they were operating according to assumptions that the Apache understood and could manipulate. What emerges from examining the strategy of false trails is a profound truth about military effectiveness, that understanding how an opponent thinks can be more valuable than possessing superior military force. The Apache had not defeated Mexican cavalry through better weapons, better training, or better military organization. The Apache had defeated Mexican cavalry through understanding that military pursuit was based on human assumptions about evidence, direction, and intention, and that these assumptions could be systematically manipulated. This required a form of intelligence that was different from the intelligence valued by conventional military institutions. It required understanding psychology. It required understanding how humans interpret evidence. It required understanding how horses moved and how pursuing cavalry thought about the relationship between horse speed and the distance of pursuit. It required understanding how fatigue and doubt would affect cavalry officers' willingness to continue pursuit. All of these forms of understanding came together in the strategy of false trails, a strategy that was not particularly complex when explained, but that was nearly impossible to counter when encountered in the actual context of frontier pursuit. The strategy became so feared that Mexican cavalry officers who encountered Apache war parties would sometimes become paralyzed by uncertainty. Which trail was genuine? Should the force be split or kept together? How could you be certain that the trail you were following was not a deliberate deception? These questions, which had never arisen before the Apache had systematized the strategy of false trails, began to dominate cavalry officers' thinking. And in dominating their thinking, the strategy achieved its ultimate victory. It made Mexican cavalry ineffective, not because the cavalry lacked courage or military skill, but because the cavalry's own cognitive processes had become the weakness that Apache warriors were exploiting. In the decades after the Apache Wars ended and the Apache had been moved to reservations, military strategists would occasionally reference the strategy of false trails as an example of how to defeat a superior force through psychological manipulation and understanding of how the opponent would think. But by that time, the knowledge that had made the strategy work, the deep understanding of how human beings interpret evidence and make decisions under uncertainty, had been lost. The strategy remained a historical curiosity, a story about an enemy that had defeated cavalry through tricks and deception rather than being recognized as what it actually was, a sophisticated form of military intelligence based on understanding human psychology and decision-making processes. Somewhere in the Sierra Madre, in canyons that tourists would later visit without understanding the history they contained, there were routes and trails that had been used for centuries by Apache warriors and their mothers and their children. And on some of those trails, if someone had known how to look, they could still see the marks left by deliberate false trails, paths that had been created not to be traveled but to be followed by cavalry who did not understand the principles by which Apache warriors were defeating them. The stone remembered. The Apache remembered. But Mexico and the United States, which had defeated the Apache and confined them to reservations, seemed to forget the lessons that had been written so clearly into the landscape.